daring stunts are thrilling, and surgeries are safe, right? Wrong. These true stories of a fatal leap, a poison umbrella, and a waking nightmare prove reality can be deadly. Picture a daredevil's leap from the Brooklyn Bridge ending in tragedy, the journalist assassinated with a ricin-laced umbrella, or a man fully conscious during surgery, unable to scream. These aren't plots from a thriller, they're real events that defy belief. Join us as we uncover 3 haunting true stories: Robert Odlum's fatal stunt, Georgi Markov's Cold War murder, and Sherman Sizemore's surgical horror. Brace yourself for tales of bravery and tragedy that reveal the chilling unpredictability of life. The rise and fall of Robert Odlum, a stuntman's fatal jump. Robert Odlum's name once rang through the streets of Washington, D.C., not for his expertise in diving or his qualifications as an instructor, but for his audacious stunts. His rise to fame, however, was as brief as it was dramatic, a tale of ambition, thrill-seeking, and ultimately, tragedy. From the very beginning, Robert was not just a man with a penchant for diving, but someone deeply driven to prove the limits of human courage and endurance. It was the late 1800s when he first made a name for himself by diving into large safety nets placed beneath burning buildings to save people trapped by fires. The stunt was a spectacle that left crowds in awe, though few understood the deep, almost primal fear that compelled those inside the burning buildings to freeze in terror rather than trust the safety net below. It was this phenomenon, the unwillingness of people to jump out of windows to save themselves, that sparked Robert's first idea. Robert, a seasoned diving instructor, believed that if people could only see someone take the leap, they might overcome their paralyzing fear. And so, he did what any man eager to test the limits of human courage might do. He became the demonstration. By collaborating with Washington, D.C.'s fire departments, Robert performed dives from multi-story buildings into safety nets, attracting large crowds who, rather than seeking safety advice, were drawn to the spectacle. This is where Robert's story took a turn. What began as a well-intentioned demonstration of bravery soon transformed into something darker. Robert was no longer just an instructor, he had become a celebrity. The crowds clamored for more, but not for safety. They wanted the thrill of watching him jump, and this newfound fame fed his ego. He began to crave the attention, not for the message of safety he initially wanted to impart, but for the adoration he received with each successful jump. However, as with all fleeting moments of fame, the inevitable happened. Robert's stunts began to lose their appeal. The thrill of his jumps off bridges, once a singular act of daring, was no longer enough to keep the public's attention. In 1885, 2 years into his rising fame, Robert's popularity began to wane. The thrill of the bridge jumps had been diminished as others had begun copying his stunts, and Robert found himself struggling to remain unique. In the world of stuntmen, there is always someone willing to take on a bigger challenge, a higher jump, and Robert needed something more. That something more came to him in the form of the Brooklyn Bridge, a colossal feat of engineering and the perfect backdrop for his most daring act yet. The Brooklyn Bridge stood 130 feet above the East River, a towering testament to the heights Robert would need to conquer. But by this time, authorities had caught on to the dangerous trend of bridge jumping, and it had been made illegal. However, Robert, ever the showman, was not deterred by such trivialities. He devised a clever scheme to stage his jump without interference. Using an underground marketing campaign, he spread word of his upcoming jump. Cryptic flyers and word of mouth ensured that the crowds would gather on the bridge, eager to witness the spectacle. On May 19th, the day of the jump, the Brooklyn Bridge was packed with spectators, eager to witness the infamous leap that promised to be the highest ever attempted. But Robert, ever the showman, had one last trick up his sleeve. As the crowd gathered, a black horse-drawn carriage appeared at one end of the bridge. The crowd's excitement surged, anticipating Robert's dramatic entrance. But as Robert made his way to the edge of the bridge, police quickly swooped in, arresting him before he could make the leap. The spectacle, however, was not yet over. As the police detained the actor posing as Robert, a second carriage appeared, this time with the real Robert Odlum. The crowd's cheers erupted once more as they realized the twist. The plan had worked. While the police were busy handling the decoy, Robert had enough time and space to leap into the unknown. The jump itself was perfect, at least, for a moment. Robert, with his signature dive technique, was poised to land safely into the water below, as he had done countless times before. But fate, as it often does, intervened. A gust of wind sent Robert tumbling off course, and in an instant, the water that was supposed to cushion his fall became his deadly enemy. Instead of breaking his fall, the water, now like concrete, shattered his body upon impact. The onlookers, initially cheering, fell silent as they watched Robert's motionless body float to the surface. When friends rushed to rescue him, it was already too late. Despite efforts to save him, Robert succumbed to the injuries he sustained. His body had been obliterated, his ribs shattered, his internal organs ruptured. What should have been a spectacular display of courage ended in tragedy, a stark reminder of the fragility of life and the unpredictable nature of human ambition. The death of Robert Odlum was a devastating blow not only to those who admired his feats but also to the very concept of daring stunts. His fall from grace was as swift as it was tragic, and his death marked the end of an era for bridge jumpers. Yet, in the wake of his untimely death, Robert's story serves as a grim reminder of the thin line between bravery and folly, a lesson that remains as relevant today as it was in the late 1800s. But what does the legacy of Robert Odlum's tragic jump teach us? It's easy to get lost in the glamour of daring acts, but they often come with a price. For Robert, that price was his life, and for those who followed in his footsteps, the lessons he left behind were haunting. Sometimes, the greatest of human achievements can also be the most fragile. And in Robert's case, that moment of glory on the Brooklyn Bridge became his last. This haunting moment, along with the strange and tragic nature of his death, sets the stage for the next story in our collection of real-life tales, stories where the truth is often stranger and darker than fiction. As we leave behind Robert's legacy, let us consider the complexity of fate, the fragility of life, and how, sometimes, one wrong move can change everything. What was once an act of pride and defiance now serves as a chilling reminder of how quickly the tide can turn. Georgi Markov, assassinated with ricin. On the morning of September 7, 1978, the bustling streets of London were about to witness a death that would become one of the most chilling and mysterious assassinations in modern history. Georgi Markov, a prominent Bulgarian dissident and BBC reporter, had been outspoken in his criticism of the Soviet Union and its regime, which undoubtedly made him a target. Little did he know that on this seemingly ordinary morning, a quiet, but sinister plot was already unfolding around him, one that would take his life in the most unimaginable way. Georgi's career had once been filled with promise and hope. A well-respected journalist, his sharp analysis and fearless reporting had earned him a place at the BBC, where he continued to expose the harsh realities of life under communist rule. But with every report he filed, the risks grew. The Soviet Union, which had long kept a tight grip on Eastern Europe, was notorious for silencing its critics through any means necessary. Georgi had become one of those critics, someone whose words could no longer go unchallenged by those in power. His reporting on the Soviet regime was not just an exploration of political happenings but a direct critique of the iron-fisted control that the Soviet government held over its people. Markov's revelations about corruption, the lack of basic freedoms, and the suppression of dissent painted a bleak picture of life behind the Iron Curtain. His courage in speaking out made him a prominent voice for the oppressed, but also an enemy to the powers that ruled. In 1970, when he had been forced to leave Bulgaria, he made his way to London, where he found a new platform in the form of the BBC. It was at this new chapter in his life that the stakes grew higher, as his reports about the injustices of the Soviet system drew even more ire from the KGB. On that fateful day, Georgi Markov was not expecting anything out of the ordinary. He had walked to work as usual, taking his typical route across Waterloo Bridge. The rain had begun to fall lightly, and he had been in the process of looking for shelter when the pain struck. A sudden, sharp sensation in the back of his right leg made him reach down instinctively, but there was nothing there, nothing he could see or feel that explained the sensation. Confused, he pressed on with his day, brushing off the discomfort as a minor inconvenience. As the hours passed, the pain worsened. What began as a brief sting in the leg had transformed into a debilitating ache that soon became unbearable. As he sat at his desk in the BBC offices, Georgi found himself unable to ignore the growing pain. At first, he had thought it might have been the result of a simple injury, maybe a misplaced pen or a stray bug bite. But as he tried to focus on his work, the pain escalated to the point where it became impossible to ignore. Eventually, he left his desk to investigate the source of the pain, only to find what appeared to be a small swelling at the back of his thigh. Dismissive of the situation, he returned to his desk, though the pain did not subside. By afternoon, Georgi could barely stand the agony. He gritted his teeth, trying to push through the discomfort, but it was futile. As he struggled with the unbearable pain, Georgi realized something was wrong, something more than just a simple injury. His leg had begun to swell rapidly, and the pain, which had initially seemed like nothing, was now excruciating. After seeking medical attention, the doctor was as confused as Georgi had been. The symptoms didn't make sense, and the situation seemed to grow worse by the minute. Doctors at the hospital were perplexed. As Georgi lay in the emergency room, the swelling on his leg continued to expand uncontrollably, and his once sharp mind began to cloud with delirium. The pain intensified, and soon, he began to show signs of confusion. He muttered to those around him, even accusing them of conspiring to kill him, though no one could understand what was happening. By the following day, his condition had worsened dramatically, and Georgi's doctors were left with no answers. The real horror, however, lay hidden beneath the surface. As Georgi's condition deteriorated rapidly, his doctors sent him for an autopsy, hoping to uncover the cause of the strange symptoms. What they discovered was truly shocking. Embedded in Georgi's leg was a tiny metallic disc. This disc, barely noticeable to the naked eye, contained the lethal poison ricin. Ricin is an extremely potent substance, far deadlier than cyanide, and it has no known antidote. The discovery left everyone stunned. How had this poison entered Georgi's body? What had happened to him? The answer, though chilling, was not immediately clear. It was revealed that the poison had been delivered via a specially designed dart. The weapon itself was hidden inside an umbrella, and the assassin had used it to inject the poison into Georgi's leg during his regular commute. The device used was sophisticated, small, and nearly undetectable. Only when the ricin-coated disc was embedded inside Georgi's leg did the poison activate, gradually overwhelming his body, leading to his slow, painful demise. It quickly became apparent that this was no random act of violence. The use of ricin, a poison favored for assassinations due to its discreet delivery, pointed directly to a well-executed political murder. The KGB, the Soviet Union's infamous intelligence agency, had long been suspected of carrying out such operations to eliminate those who spoke out against their regime. Georgi Markov's vocal opposition to Soviet policies, particularly his criticisms of their heavy-handed tactics, had made him a prime target. In the wake of his death, speculation grew about who could have carried out such a brazen assassination. Theories abound, but none could offer definitive proof. However, one story, told by a former KGB officer named Oleg Kalugin, gained traction. Kalugin claimed that he had been involved in a covert operation targeting Markov, suggesting that the KGB had orchestrated the hit. According to Kalugin, a KGB agent had followed Georgi on his morning commute, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The assassin, armed with the ricin-loaded umbrella, had approached Georgi at the bus stop, delivering the fatal dose of poison. The agent then vanished into the crowd, leaving no trace of the attack. Though the circumstances of Georgi's death were shrouded in secrecy, there were lingering questions that would never be answered. Was this a carefully planned assassination carried out by the KGB? Or was there another motive at play? Who was truly behind Georgi's tragic demise? These questions remain unanswered, leaving the death of Georgi Markov as one of the most tragic and mysterious events in modern history. The story of Georgi Markov is a grim reminder of the lengths to which powerful regimes will go to silence their critics. It's also a poignant reflection on the strange and tragic nature of human history, where real-life stories often seem stranger than fiction. In Georgi's case, a man who merely sought to share the truth found himself caught in a deadly game of politics, where the cost of speaking out was far too high. As we reflect on the mysterious death of Georgi Markov, we are reminded of how the truth can be both powerful and dangerous. The relentless pursuit of those who dare to speak out against injustice, the political intrigue, and the chilling methods used to silence dissent are all part of a larger narrative, one that continues to unfold to this day. Yet, for Georgi Markov, the ultimate price of his courage was his life, leaving a legacy that speaks volumes about the price of standing up for what is right, no matter the cost. The tragedy of Markov's assassination lies not just in the method used but in the lack of closure. For years, theories continued to swirl, but the KGB's involvement was never definitively proven, despite Kalugin's testimony. The lack of a clear answer, coupled with the high level of secrecy surrounding the event, added layers of intrigue and suspicion to the story. In fact, Markov's death remains one of the most notorious unsolved political assassinations in modern history, symbolizing the danger that accompanies those who challenge totalitarian regimes. And as we look ahead to the next story, we must ask ourselves, how far are we willing to go in the pursuit of truth, and how much are we willing to sacrifice to uncover the stories that shape our world? The strange, the tragic, and the unbelievable are often closer to us than we think. Sherman Sizemore, the tragic experience of anesthesia awareness. Sherman Sizemore was no stranger to danger. Born into a world where risk was the price of survival, he spent the better part of his life mining coal in the dangerous depths of West Virginia. Every day was a battle with the earth, underground, where a single misstep could be fatal. But Sherman had survived it all, or so it seemed. He had defied death countless times and lived to tell the tale. He was tough, reliable, the embodiment of strength and perseverance. His career in the mines had left him with scars, physically and emotionally, but he had risen above them all. By the time he hit his retirement years, Sherman had become something of a local legend. With his burly frame and imposing presence, he was a man people respected. But beneath that tough exterior was a man who was deeply devoted to his faith and his family. In his later years, he turned to a quieter life, becoming an ordained Baptist minister, finding peace in guiding others. But like all seemingly peaceful lives, there are moments when the silence breaks. In Sherman's case, that break came without warning, on the cold afternoon of January 19th. It was a day like any other, at least it seemed that way at first. Sherman had been feeling the effects of a persistent, sharp pain in his abdomen, an ache that had grown steadily worse over the last few months. It was a constant reminder of his aging body and perhaps the toll the mines had taken on him. Despite the discomfort, Sherman continued to live his life with the same stoicism that had always defined him. But when the pain became unbearable, he and his wife, Ruby, decided it was time to go to the doctor. They made an appointment for an exploratory surgery to determine the cause of the pain. Sherman's family had no idea that this routine procedure would unravel the very fabric of his being. They had no way of knowing that the simple act of entering the hospital for surgery would lead to a terrifying, tragic journey. Sherman, the man who had fought through years of danger in the mines, would face a horror he was ill-prepared for, one that no one could have predicted. The morning of January 19th started with Sherman in good spirits. He was, as always, the strong and dependable man he had always been. He said his goodbyes to Ruby and his daughter, kissed them both, and walked into the hospital with an air of calm resolve. The surgery was scheduled, and Sherman expected nothing more than a brief respite from the pain. But what happened next was anything but routine. Inside the operating room, Sherman lay flat on the table, his eyes fixed on the sterile lights above. The anesthesiologist prepared to administer the drugs that would put him to sleep as the surgeons prepped for the procedure. Sherman knew the drill, he had been under anesthesia before. But this time, things went terribly wrong. The anesthesiologist, whether by mistake or by negligence, administered only part of the required dosage. The paralyzing drug was delivered without the anesthetic that would have put Sherman into a deep, painless sleep. Sherman, expecting to drift into unconsciousness, began to count backward from 10. He had done this countless times before. But this time, as his mind ticked down from 10 to 0, he realized something was horribly wrong. He was still awake. He could feel everything, his body was frozen in place, unable to move. His muscles were locked, and he could not make a sound. He could only move his eyes, and even those were taped shut, leaving him in complete darkness. panic set in. Was he dreaming? No. The pain, sharp, unrelenting, was too real. And then, the horror began. The surgeon, oblivious to Sherman's torment, stepped forward and made an incision. Sherman felt the cold steel of the scalpel as it cut into his flesh. The surgeon's gloved hands worked methodically, pulling and tugging at Sherman's insides. Sherman wanted to scream, wanted to fight back, but his body was betrayed by the drugs that had left him paralyzed. All he could do was flick his eyes desperately, hoping someone, anyone, would see the terror in them. But no one noticed. The surgeons continued their work, undisturbed by the fact that Sherman was fully aware, fully conscious, and fully feeling every agonizing second. The nurses handed over the surgical tools as the surgeon asked for more. Sherman's body felt every tug, every pressure, every movement inside of him. His stomach churned with pain, his mind raced with terror. He couldn't comprehend what was happening to him. The minutes stretched on, each one lasting an eternity. Sherman's eyes flitted left and right, desperately seeking help, but the medical team remained oblivious to his silent pleas. The surgeon continued his work, unaware that Sherman was still awake. At this point, Sherman could only endure the onslaught of agony, the cruel and unrelenting pain that tore through him. He prayed for it to end, for the darkness of unconsciousness to finally claim him. Then, finally, a nurse noticed. She looked at Sherman's eyes and saw the horror within them. She screamed for the surgeon to stop, but it was too late. Sherman had already endured what felt like an eternity of torture. The anesthesiologist rushed over, realizing the mistake that had been made. He pumped Sherman full of painkillers, hoping to subdue the suffering. But it was too little, too late. The drugs that were supposed to have knocked Sherman out had only paralyzed him. He had felt every incision, every tug, and every pull. His body had been violated in a way no one could comprehend. The trauma was too much. The mental anguish he endured in those moments would haunt him for the rest of his life. When Sherman was finally allowed to rest, he was moved to recovery. He awoke, but something was wrong. The sense of dread that had begun to creep up on him in the operating room never left. He could not explain the terror that had settled in his chest. His body felt different, as though something inside of him had been irrevocably altered. The memories of the surgery began to seep into his consciousness, fragmented, horrifying flashes of the pain he had endured. The images haunted him, but he couldn't understand why. As the days went on, Sherman's mind began to unravel. He was no longer the man his family had known. The terror he had experienced during the surgery twisted his mind, causing him to spiral into paranoia. He became convinced that something had gone terribly wrong, that he had been violated in a way that no one could understand. He believed that he had been targeted, that someone wanted to harm him. The rational, calm man was gone, replaced by a man gripped by fear and confusion. Sherman's family was helpless. They didn't know what to do. Ruby, his wife, tried to comfort him, but she could see the man she had known slipping away. Sherman became more withdrawn, more agitated. He was terrified of being alone, convinced that others were out to get him. His once solid world had crumbled, leaving behind a broken man who could not escape the trauma of what he had endured. The memory of his surgery, although blocked from his conscious mind, was seeping into his soul. He became distant, unrecognizable. His paranoia grew, and he started to believe that people were conspiring against him. He was convinced that his family was involved, that they were plotting to bury him alive. Sherman was no longer the man he had been. The surgery had taken more than his body, it had taken his sanity. In the days that followed, Sherman's behavior became increasingly erratic. He would scream out at nothing, his eyes wide with terror, but no one could understand what he was seeing. His family did their best to care for him, but they were out of their depth. They sought help from doctors, but by then, Sherman's mind was so deeply fractured that there was little anyone could do. The terror of his trauma had consumed him completely. On February 2nd, just 2 weeks after the surgery, Sherman's pain reached its breaking point. He could no longer live with the memories of what he had endured, the images of the surgery replaying in his mind. Unable to escape the torment of his mind, he took his own life. Sherman's tragic end left his family shattered. They couldn't comprehend what had happened to the man they had once known. It wasn't just the loss of a life, it was the loss of a man who had been consumed by the horror of an experience he could never escape. The doctors and surgeons involved in the procedure never knew the full extent of the damage they had caused. But for Sherman, there was no escape. His family would go on to sue the hospital, and while they were awarded a settlement, it could never bring back the man they had lost. The story of Sherman Sizemore is a tragic reminder of the unimaginable horrors that can arise from something as seemingly routine as surgery. His experience, though rare, is a chilling example of what can go wrong when the systems we trust fail us. It's a story that will forever be etched in the minds of those who knew him and serve as a stark reminder of the fragility of the human mind. And as we reflect on Sherman's life, his pain, and his untimely death, we are left with a question: how often do we take for granted the systems and procedures that are supposed to keep us safe? How often do we overlook the potential for human error, not realizing that a single mistake can lead to a tragedy that will reverberate throughout a life forever? Sherman's story is not just a cautionary tale about anesthesia awareness, it is a reflection on how quickly life can change. From a trusted pillar of his community to a man torn apart by the very systems meant to keep him safe, Sherman's tale is a reminder of the dangers that can lurk in the seemingly mundane. The depths of the trauma he endured are unimaginable, and his suffering is something that no family should ever have to witness. His loss is a testament to the often invisible scars left by trauma, and how even those who seem unbreakable can be shattered by a single moment of medical error. As we reflect on the strange and tragic events that have shaped the lives of individuals like Robert Odlum, Georgi Markov, and Sherman Sizemore, we are forced to confront the unpredictable nature of fate. Each of these real-life stories serves as a reminder that the most unbelievable occurrences often happen outside the boundaries of fiction. The events that befell these men, whose courage and tragedies have become part of history, demonstrate how fragile life can be and how quickly things can spiral out of control. What binds these stories together is the profound unpredictability of life. Each man, in his own way, confronted an unimaginable event that shook him to his core. The courage they exhibited in facing life's challenges was evident, but so too were the overwhelming tragedies that befell them. In the end, it is the unexpected outcomes, those moments when fate takes a cruel turn, that make their stories so poignant. The reality is, no matter how prepared we think we are, life has a way of surprising us in the most unbelievable ways. These real-life occurrences highlight the fragility of human existence, the randomness of fate, and the shocking nature of tragedy. There are lessons to be learned from the suffering of others, lessons about the importance of never taking our safety for granted, about the price of fame and glory, and about the devastating impact that medical errors can have on a person's life. We are all vulnerable to the unforeseen twists of fate that can alter our lives in an instant,